There we go.
Okay.
Recording.
Here we go. Hey there. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Lou Chain with the Hearth team at Keller Williams, and Joey and I are here for you if you need to buy or sell a home in Portland or Vancouver. Today, we are thrilled to have Randy Blazak here to talk about the roots of bias. Randy is the chair of Oregon's Coalition Against Hate Crimes. His chosen charity for today's event is the National Black Trans Advocacy Coalition, and we'll send you an email after the event with a link to donate if you so choose. If you're, I already went over the gallery versus speaker view, and this event is being recorded. And Randy, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Lou. Wow. Hey, I'm really glad that we could do this on a nice, chilly July day in Portland. What are we going to do? When summer 2020 has been canceled anyway, so let's meet on Zoom and talk about some stuff that matters. Excuse me. This is always kind of an important issue to talk about, bias and racism, but it seems more important than ever with what's happening in America, what's happening in the streets of the city, what's happening in our police departments, what's happening on Twitter, with our president tweeting repeated defenses of the Confederate flag just in the last 24 hours. And so to understand a little bit about what we need to do or how we get a handle on this, it's kind of helpful to understand what's at play and what are some of the roots of this. And this is a huge topic. I mean, we're just here for an hour to lunch and learn. Hope people are lunching. Are you lunching? So we're just going to take a little bit of this from kind of a sociological angle, a little bit from a psychological angle, a little bit from a historical angle, but also talk about what we need to do to kind of get in front of this and maybe turn the corner in our history that we're in. Just as a little bit of a background, I've been doing this work for a very long time. My PhD is in sociology and criminology from Emory University in Atlanta, but I grew up in a town in Georgia that is in the news right now called Stone Mountain. Stone Mountain, largest exposed piece of granite, birthplace of the modern Ku Klux Klan in 1915, the largest exposed Confederate memorial. You know, they're tearing down statues, but they can't tear down this mountain, so they have to figure out what to do with it. There was, on the 4th of July, a black militia march through the park to reclaim it. And so Stone Mountain, always relevant. It was mentioned in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and I have a feeling it's being mentioned by people right now as we speak. So I grew up around the Klan, and I started my work at Emory trying to understand the rise of hate groups, especially in the 1980s, a group called the racist skinheads, not the unracist skinheads or the anti-racist skinheads, or people who were just bald. The sort of new hate group that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, and that was very active in the Pacific Northwest, including involved in a brutal murder in Portland. In 1988, Ethiopian named Mulugeta Sarah was beaten to death with baseball bats in Southeast Portland on November 12th, 1988. So my work has been spent trying to understand those folks, including in prisons and Klan rallies and militia groups and on and on. So as a cisgendered straight white male, I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who very easily could have been pulled into the world of right-wing extremism and racism. And just because I wasn't, and I became an anti-racist educator, blah, 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 doesn't mean that those issues aren't inside me. I grew up in a white supremacist world. I've internalized white supremacy. I've internalized sexism and homophobia and ableism and all those other things. And so sometimes I think, God, what am I doing as a white person talking about these issues? But I think it's really clear right now, white people need to be talking about these issues. It's why White Fragility is the #1 bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. There was a tweet from Wanda Sykes, the African-American lesbian comedian, about a month ago, who said, it was on Instagram, she said, I don't want to see any more Black people marching against racism. I need to see white people marching. So I think there is both permission, but also a kind of a window that we have, that we've always had, but there's sort of a moment in history now for people to explore their privileges, explore their role in it, and stop saying things like, I'm not racist, or I'm not sexist, or we got to move past all that fragility stuff, which I had, as someone who grew up in Stone Mountain, my Facebook page is filled with my old friends from Stone Mountain and from Portland who say, well, it's all good, right? You had a black president, it's all solved. So what I want to do today is talk about the kind of lay of the land. And I prepared a little PowerPoint presentation. Let's see if I can do this, to kind of guide us through this conversation, and recognizing that we're just scratching the surface. Okay, let me see if I can do this. I should be getting good at the Zoom right now. So hopefully you all can see my little slideshow. Pop, 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 pop. Okay, cool. Oh, good. So first of all, I mean, we got a whole bunch of stuff that's happening right now. I mean, a whole bunch of things to keep an eye on. One of the things, and again, real briefly, we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years, an increase in hate crimes and bias incidents, but especially in the last year, and especially targeting Asian Americans initially, as the COVID pandemic was labeled the Wuhan flu, or the Chinese virus. And so we've just seen a sad increase in both hate crimes and incidents. In Oregon, we have a new bias crime law that the governor signed into law last fall, that also tracks not only things that are criminal, like beating people up and vandalizing property and threatening people, but bias incidents, telling people to go back where they came from and things like that. So we've seen an uptick in that. We've seen the sort of normalization of white nationalism. We've seen, neo-Nazi Twitter accounts being retweeted by the president, and we've seen white nationalists show up at the anti-shutdown rallies. And it's bizarre to me as someone, I went into the field to study skinheads, racist skinheads in 1988, and here we are 32 years later, and these folks are kind of in the mainstream. We're looking at the threat of domestic terrorism. What we saw in 1995 with the Oklahoma City bombing, if folks remember that was an attempt to start a race war in America among the sort of militia-minded anti-government groups that were out there, and that has been ramped up again. So you might have heard the term boogaloo. This is sort of their slang term for a second American Revolution or a second Civil War. And those folks are out there. We've seen in the education world, some issues around how little people understand our past. And so one of the things we did in Oregon last year is pass a law that includes genocide education into the curriculum, Holocaust education, because kids didn't know what Auschwitz was, didn't know what the Holocaust was. And there's just sort of, as we move farther and farther and farther away from the mid 20th century, fewer people know what the extreme of that is. We've seen more bullying in schools, especially targeting trans kids and Latino kids and Muslim kids. We, of course, have this issue about racialized policing that has been front of our minds since the George Floyd killing. And when I talk about these issues, I really try to focus on the notion of hate as a continuum. We can talk about neo-Nazis and Klansmen and those folks. And when I go out and talk to high school kids, they love to talk about the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis. It's just fascinating because those things are so dramatic. But then I start saying, well, okay, we've talked about the Nazis a little bit. Let's talk about using hateful language like "that's so gay" or "don't be retarded." And they kind of like, what? You're going to talk about us? I'm like, yeah, I'm going to talk about us. I'm going to include myself in it because there's a continuum that includes genocide at one end and hate crimes and violent racism and discrimination and, things that we would call microaggressions. When people say, oh, that was just a joke, I didn't mean anything by it, that would include flying the rebel flag. So we have to really think of it as a continuum. And part of this conversation is about busting through the binary. And part of that binary is us good, woke, liberal people over here and those bad inbred neo-Nazi hillbillies over there. In fact, we've internalized a lot of the same stuff. And one of the things I learned from 5 years of sort of living among the natives and spending time with neo-Nazis and white supremacists and Klansmen and all this thing, I just sort of look back on those days. Oh, those were the days when you could go to a Klan rally in person. You didn't have to have your Klan rally on Zoom. Is that those folks weren't very different from me at all. We had a lot of things in common, and so we are. That brings us back to the Black Lives Matter movement that we are experiencing, and the question: do Black Lives matter in 2020? and there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. So this is just sort of the scope of all the things, and there's more, right? There's more, including, this discrimination in housing, and on and on. These are just some of the top items that we're tackling. So,
hey, Andy,
yeah.
I think somebody's waiting to get in, just letting you know.
Oh, okay, do I need to do that?
Yeah, it's only you when I made you the host, I think you're the only one that can let folks in. Sorry about that.
No. Hold on. Sorry about that. Well, can you, oh, I can't. All right, hold on. Well, we will let those people in. Okay, and we'll make sure to say hello to them. And let me know anytime I need to let people in. Hey, late people, sorry. I forgot that as the host, I'm in charge of letting people in, so I apologize for that. So I was just sort of giving people a little bit of the lay of the land of our situation that we're dealing with here. So let me go back to my slides. And Lou, let me know if I need to let any other folks in. I'll try to do both. So just to go back, we were talking about some of these wide-ranging issues that we're confronting. All right, I'm gonna just do this so I can kind of see everything that's going on. So on a kind of psychological level, one of the things that's at work here, as I mentioned, is this notion of binary thinking. And I know a lot of computer people know the binary very well. Everything is a 0 or 1, it's on or it's off. But we are kind of trained to think in binary terms. We think about, so for example, the way that we think about gender. We are taught that gender, we have opposite sexes, that men and women are opposite, that men are from Mars and women are from Venus and all that silliness. And as we get older, we realize that doesn't make any sense. We're not opposites. Everybody has a pancreas. So we're not opposites. And so, we realize that we're much more similar. In fact, this might be news to some people, that men and women are from the same planet, and women are like people. But we learn that sort of black and white worldview, and good versus evil. Like the good people, that's us, and the evil people are over there. And so part of this binary thinking that we get trapped in, besides talking about gender and good and evil, and I think one of the big binaries that we really suffer from in America is the notion of red states and blue states, that red states and blue states are, different, and they're different people. And when you look at the attitude surveys of most Americans, we're pretty much purple. Everybody has a little bit of conservative and a little bit of liberal, and it's all mixed together, and it changes. You watch a Charlton Heston movie and you're more conservative, and you watch a Michael Moore documentary, or maybe a Roger Moore documentary, and you become more liberal. I mean, we are not binary. But where this really takes off, and where this has really had a big impact in the last few years, is the notion of conspiracy theories. And this image on the slide is this guy, Alex Jones, who is like the master conspiracy theorist. And we love conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are fun. When I was a kid, it was all about who killed John F. Kennedy. Was it the Russians, or was it the communists, or was it the labor unions, or was it the Cubans, or was it like Marilyn Monroe's boyfriend, or what? There are all these conspiracy theories about who killed John, the Democrats, and then we learned from that Oliver Stone movie that Lyndon Johnson killed John Kennedy. So those conspiracy, and of course, they go way back, and the most famous one, of course, is the one that Hitler used to rise to power in the 1930s, at the fall of Germany and the collapse of the German economy and the German Empire was because of a global Jewish conspiracy. So those conspiracy theories can be fun on one hand, but they can be very dark. And so we have seen a return of those conspiracy theories, largely fueled by the internet. The internet creates a place where people can find information that's both legitimate and completely bogus. And so you can find all kinds of conspiracy theories on the internet. This is why Alex Jones has become such a superstar in his medium. And those conspiracy theories explain the deep state. There was something controlling the government and the Republican and the Democratic parties. They're something that they're, these puppet masters. And so it takes things away from the complexity. So as a social scientist, I was listening to NPR this morning. They were interviewing some professor about something related to COVID, and they were asking her to explain something. And she said, well, as a professor, I'm bound to say that the answer is it's complicated, because we're always looking at the complex nature of social processes and institutions. The economy is complex, right? I mean, there's a lot of moving parts, but if I can say the economy is tanking because of the Chinese or because of illegal immigrants from Mexico, I've simplified something that's very complex. And so you take these very complex things like race. Race is an incredibly complex concept, and which, by the way, is a made up concept. There's no such thing as race biologically. There's no thing. In fact, when the Human Genome Project was completed in 2003, they found more genetic diversity within so-called races than between races. White people were invented. They invented the notion of white people to justify white supremacy in the 1600s. So, but it's a very complex issue. But if I can come up with a nice little conspiracy theory, that it makes these complex things very easy to understand. So us versus them, you know, scapegoating ties into that. The notion, I had someone ask me on Facebook who is white, why can Black people say the N-word and I can't? Like, gosh darn it, I really want to say the N-word. Why won't people let me say the N-word? You know, and the answer is complex. The answer has to do with reclaiming a very hurtful word that has to do with being able to say things within your family that people aren't allowed to say outside the family. But, you know, it just seems very unfair. And so there's this zero-sum game at work for a lot of people. And there's some good psychological research that backs up who's most likely to buy into this, that if one group is gaining, it must mean we're losing. If women are gaining power, it must mean that men are losing power. If immigrants are gaining power, it must mean citizens are losing power. And so a really good example where you see this in the current context is the All Lives Matter folks, who including folks in my family who I won't name, who have told me that Black Lives Matter means that white lives don't matter. And I was like, Dad, no. You know, it's like if I say apple trees matter, it means that cherry trees don't matter. You know, the whole point of Black Lives Matter is that all lives do matter, but Black lives have been devalued by systemic racism for a very long time. But there's this notion, well, if they're talking about themselves, it must mean that I'm less. That's zero-sum thinking. And the reality is much more complex, and then sort of all shades of gray, you know, because context matters. So part of the psychological root of this is this binary that we get locked into, that one group's ascension must mean we're being dropped down from our position, you know, like a teeter-totter. And in reality, there's room for all of us. So one of the things, just among other things that we'll get a chance to talk about, is that there is this binary that we really have to bust through. And I think in Portland, one of the binaries that we really are challenged by is the notion that all cops are bastards. I mean, I don't know how many times I've seen that spray painted all over the place. Like, that's a binary, that all the cops are good and us woke people over here, or all the cops are bad and us woke people are good and they're all Nazis and we're all, you know, it's just, it's more complex than that. And there are a lot of really progressive cops, and there are a lot of protesters who are complete, you know, authoritarian personalities. And so that binary, we really have to break through that, which is challenging to some folks. Okay, on the sociological side, so I mentioned at the beginning I'm a sociologist, so this one sort of resonates a little bit more with me, is what is happening in our society? And this is really the big thing that I found when I started studying skinheads in the late 1980s, and explains the Trump ascension in the mid-2010s and what's happening now. And there's this great French term called anomie. Came from this one of our founding sociologists named Emile Durkheim, who did a study on suicide in 1897. And he defined it as the sense of normlessness. And he was looking at suicide rates. So for example, one of the things that Durkheim found over 100 years ago was that Protestants had higher suicide rates than Catholics. And that's because Catholics had lots of rules. There's a lot, I don't know if you've ever been to a Catholic wedding. They last forever. There's lots of rules. There's lots of genuflecting and Hail Marys and Our Fathers and confessions and midnight masses and stations of the cross and 1,000 saints. Protestants, it's like, yeah, there's the Bible. As my grandma would say, Randy, we don't have religion, we're Presbyterian. Like, there's the Bible, go figure it out. So when you're blue and you don't have that structure that the Catholics have, you're more likely to, you know, jump off the tower. So that sense of anomie that Durkheim was talking about is super applicable now. That this notion of normlessness, because one of the things that causes anomie is rapid social change. when things change too quickly. And what Durkheim was talking about in 1897 was people were moving into the city and people were moving from farms into factories, and they were getting rid of the king and trying to have democracy. And there was all this change that happened all of a sudden. Everybody's like, whoa, that's anomie. Well, we are like that right now, because think about the demographic shifts that we've gone through in the last 50 or 60 years, right? What America looks like. We are much more demographically diverse in terms of race and ethnicity. We are a browning nation by 2050. The Census Bureau predicts the piece of the pie that's white will be smaller than the piece that's non-white. So that freaks a whole bunch of people out. We are much more diverse in terms of our gender representation. There are more women working now than, I don't know, with COVID, that may be out the window, but at least up to the beginning of this year, there are more women working than men, right? Because of the change of the economy. There are more people who are out and proud. As a kid in Stone Mountain, we knew that they were gay people. They lived in this place called San Francisco. There certainly were no gay people in Stone Mountain, Georgia, in our family, in our school, in our workplace, or our friend circle. And then it's funny, my freshman dorm, we called my freshman dorm at Emory the popcorn popper, because kids would just sort of come out. Frank's out, John's out. All of a sudden, when they got away from home and their shirts. So, we are much more inclusive in terms of our sexuality, and especially when we think about the recent addition to the conversation of trans people to the main discussion about gender identity. And so that's changed a lot. We are, culturally changing. My students, I have to tell them what this acronym is, which I think everybody here might know, WASP, right? W-A-S-P, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? That has gone through a huge transformation, but also in terms of our economy. When we go back 50 or 60 years, the number one employer in America was General Motors. And if you worked at GM, you belonged to a union that worked for your wages to be increased every 2 years. You had health care, you had pension, you had a rung up the ladder, and you had the American dream. You could buy a house, a small house, but you could buy a house and start to build equity. You could send your kids to the state college, and you had the American dream. The number one employer now, and again, 2020 is a weird year, but up to this year, was Walmart. A third of the people who work at Walmart live below the poverty line. So we've gone through these huge changes, and then you sort of technology into that, like how fast all this, I'm pointing to Zoom over here, all this has changed, right? So we are going through this rapid change that is both exciting, right? I mean, I as someone who does this work, I love the browning of America. I married into it, so I may have a vested interest that America becoming browner. It's been very good to me. And that my friends who are gay can be out, and my friends who are trans can, live their full lives, and, on and on. But there are a lot of people who are freaked out. They are freaked out, and they buy into this thing that we all do, which is romanticizing the past. It's always better in the past. Let me tell you what it was like to go to a record store and buy records. I was looking at the top 100 today on the Billboard charts. It's like Lil Baby or something. I don't even, how do we even figure that out? We went and bought a 45 record. I'm in my record room like this. This is an REM record. We went and bought these are called 45. Oh, that's not a good one. These called, wait. This is one I actually bought at a record store. Linda Ronstadt, 45, right? You don't do that anymore. And so those days were so much better. So we always think the past is better. As we get older, this is just something that we do. It was so much better back then. It's so scary now because there's so much anomie, and I don't know how things work. I don't know how the Hot 100 works, and I don't know how gender identity works, and all these things are kind of scary. So let's go back to the past. So one of the responses to anomie is this sort of hyper nostalgia. It was good back in the good old days. So there was a phrase that maybe you've heard it, the phrase that pays, "Make America Great Again." Make America Great Again. You see, it's like on a hat. I don't know, made in China. In 2016, that's when Trump was running for president, right? 2016, CNN asked candidate Trump, when is the again and again? Because that statement, "Make America Great Again," assumes that America was great, but is no longer great, right? But when is the again? And they asked him, when's he again? And I think, but they were probably secretly hoping he didn't say like 1850, 1850. Those were the days. But it was, what he said was 1950. He said late 1940s, 1950. Yeah. And so, you want to hope that he was talking about the economy when we had a booming post-war economy, but also in 1950, we had the highest rate of union membership and the highest tax rate of the rich. So I'm like, yeah, let's go back to that. But what a lot of people heard when he said 1950 was that was the peak of Jim Crow. That was before the modern feminist movement. That was before transgender bathrooms and Stonewall. And that was before the disability rights movement. And that was before all the civil rights movement to make America more inclusive, when straight, white, cisgendered men were the king of the heap and nobody was challenging them. 1950 was not good for a lot of people. If you were a queer person or a Black person or a disabled person or a woman person, probably, the current era is a little bit better. But a lot of people heard that, like in the past, there was no anomie. Men were men. I laugh because I lived in Ireland for a while, so they used to say Ireland where the men are men and the sheep are nervous, which I think is unfair to sheep. But, somehow in the past, somehow in the past, everything was better and made more sense. And there's just so much confusion now. I go to, Home Depot and it's in Spanish and I don't know, it's in English too, but the Spanish confuses me because I don't know what all these people are sort of freaking out over that. And so they want to go back. And so what we're really looking at now is this moment of where we're trying to figure out what to do with our anomie, where we're trying to figure out, do we go back to a time when things made sense? And sure, there was white only signs and there weren't transgender bathrooms and women, were stuck in the kitchen or do we take it to the next step? And so this discussion about white fragility, a lot of that has to do with the fact that white people, and I'm very happy, it's around here somewhere, I've assigned this book for a while, White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo's book, they just on the issue of race, because there's also, we could talk about male fragility and cis fragility and a lot of other fragilities, but how hard it is for white people to even talk about the problem of race in the 21st century, that it's been solved, it's a thing of the past. You had a Black president, shut up about it. Like that, just the idea of getting people to talk about it challenges this notion that we have to move forward, not back. So that is also a factor. And then when we sort of throw in history to this, my work over the last 10 years has really started to focus on the role that trauma plays in all this. And I feel every time I have an opportunity, I should talk about trauma. And it is super helpful, I think, in understanding what's happening now in this moment that we're in, especially around the Black Lives Matter movement. And so racism is not just a prejudice. Racism is not, and anytime any people, white people say, well, Black people can be prejudiced too, or Black people can be racist too. I'm like, oh God, okay. Yeah, they can. They've internalized the same white supremacist crap that the rest of us internalize. Studies show that Black people, African-American people do have racism towards other African-American people. The lighter the skin, the higher the value. And so we actually have a starting point in our history for this, which was the mid 1400s when the Pope in Rome needed a way to justify slavery, because it's hard, we've always had slavery. We've always had people going to war against another tribe. And when you beat that tribe, you can enslave them. That goes way back. And that was in Africa, and the Romans did it, and Native Americans enslaved each other. We've always had that type of slavery. But enslaving people through war is expensive. If you need a cheap form of labor, you have to be able to enslave people. But in the Catholic Church, in the Christian tradition, slavery is a kind of a no-no, because there was this guy Moses, maybe you've heard of Moses, played by Charlton Heston, who was famous for all kinds of things, manna falling from the heaven and turning his stick into a snake, and he had all these cool magic tricks. But the thing he's most famous for is freeing the slaves of Egypt, right? Let my people go, he told the Pharaoh, and then they took off on their exodus to wander the desert, where they still are to this day. No, that's a little joke. They've got Israel, so they're all right, right? It's all good. That's a whole nother discussion about the history of anti-Semitism. But anyway, if that's your religion, you can't go enslave other people because then you become the pharaoh. So the Pope in 1452 sort of signs this thing called the Dum Dervasis, which basically says the people of Africa are no longer people. They aren't people, they are beasts of the field. They are soulless animals. And therefore you can enslave them just like you would go capture horses or something, that they are not, you're not enslaving people. They're not people, they're animals. And so that dehumanization of African origin people is the beginning of modern racism. And we are still dealing with that now. It justified slavery, for 500 years, Blacks were enslaved because of this Christian idea that they didn't have souls. And it wasn't as if in 1865, when the Civil War ends, it's all good in the hood and everybody's back to normal, and all that intense brutalization. I mean, I tell my students about the brutality of the slave trade. It was based on murder and rape and kidnapping children and mutilating people and stringing them on and on and on and on. In fact, this image on the slide is the famous Peggy Garner, who murdered her daughter to prevent her from being captured by white slavers. Death was better than life as a slave. And there are tons of these stories of mothers killing their children to prevent them from being slaves. That's how brutal it was. And it's not as if in 1865 it just ends, right? It continues through Jim Crow and mass incarceration. And when you think about the traumatic impact of slavery, it's intergenerational. Those ideas about dehumanization are passed down by white people and other non-Black people, but also within the African community. That notion of being dehumanized or declassified as a human being persists. And there's this great book that I've assigned many times called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by a PSU professor named Dr. Joy DeGree, that really kind of supports this with data. And so when we talk about the George Floyd murder, and we have to call it that, that's another piece of the trauma. To see, one of the things that was most moving for me as someone who's been doing this work for a while is to see grown African-American men on national TV, on CNN or whatever, in tears, because of the trauma of seeing this man have the life squeezed out of him for 8 minutes and 46 seconds by an official of the state, a cop. And that just adds to the trauma, of which there are all kinds of things. The Confederate battle flag, right? The people that want to fly this, including the president, says, don't take it down. NASCAR has its worst ratings ever. That is a reminder of dehumanization. Even most African Americans' last names, right? Their names, my last name is Blazak. It's a Czech name. My great-grandfather came over here in 1891 or something. And I have my Czech heritage through my name. Most African Americans have a slave name, either the name of the president, Lincoln, or a president, or the name of their slave owner. That is a reminder of their dehumanization. So there is a constant dehumanization, and that's why the Black Lives Matter movement is speaking to this issue of no more trauma. Right? We are going to reclaim our humanity because it has been taken away fairly effectively through the criminal justice system, and before that Jim Crow, and before that slavery. And so this is a key component of understanding kind of what's happening right now. And there's an impact of that historical trauma. I was just going to show you a little infogram about kind of what happens when you are on the receiving end of this. I mean, we just had a video surface today of an attempted lynching back east of an African-American man by a bunch of sort of white, I won't use the word rednecks, but white guys in the woods who wanted to lynch a Black man. And so there are internalizations of this negative impact. And I just like to include this discussion in this because when we're trying to understand the moment that we're in, we're not looking. I had one of my circle from Stone Mountain say, well, they arrested the cops that killed George Floyd. Why are people still protesting? Because it's not about George Floyd, it's about all the George Floyds, including the George Floyds that have happened since George Floyd. And just the incredible reminder of you are not fully admitted in the society and you cannot breathe. And the people that I have been studying, the racists, the overt racists, the white supremacists, literally want that to happen. They want folks not to breathe. But those of us that commit microaggressions or discrimination or say, oh, it was just a joke, or I didn't mean anything by it, it's okay, I marched in the 60s and I voted for Obama, are also a part of that process, that bias It prevents people from being full people. Okay, I'm whizzing through this because I want to kind of get to the way that we address these things and kind of what we do about it. I feel like we have been given a gift. Thank you. I mean, there's a lot of people suffering because of the coronavirus, and certainly, 130,000 plus have now died in this country. Yeah, so there's a lot of suffering that's happening. But for those of us that have weathered the storm of the virus, we've been given a great gift. We have a moment to reflect. We have a moment to learn. We have a moment to read. We have a moment to reach out. We have a moment to kind of take on things that maybe we didn't have time for before. And I think there is a great opportunity here. A part of this, and hopefully this little lunch and learn that we're doing is a part of this, because I do want to have a conversation as soon as I shut up, is to have these brave conversations, to be able to call out bias in speech and behavior among our friends. To say, hey, I don't think that's right. And it's happened to me. I had a student in my class, one of my classes at PSU, call me out for using the word gypsy and saying that's a derogatory term. Those are the Romani people, and there's a history of hurt. And I thought, I never even thought about that. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that we participate in this. So to call out bias, and and that, as a white person, people say racist things to me and I'm just supposed to be quiet. As a male person, people say sexist things to me and I'm just supposed to be quiet. As an able-bodied person, people say ableist things to me and I'm just supposed to be quiet. There's an opportunity here to not lecture people and jump down people's throat, but to have these conversations. Say, I don't really feel comfortable with that. But also, part of this is having a conversation about privilege. I mean, this is the most courageous conversation of all, because there are a lot of people who don't want to acknowledge privilege. It's like the hardest conversation in the work that I do, especially training. And I do training with law enforcement and with, federal workers and lawyers, and like nobody, I'm not privileged. I've worked hard for everything. That's not what privilege is. Privilege is the advantage you have because of something that society's created. And the way that I have this conversation about privilege, when I want to kind of get people to start to think about white privilege, is I ask, if I've got a room full of people, I ask, are there any left-handed people here? And usually odds are somebody will raise their left hand, and I'll say, will you tell me just a couple of the advantages that people who are right-handed have? And the list goes on and on. Besides scissors, there's all, even phones and our computers. And I had a student who was National Guard who said, she told me that the safety on the rifle is set up for right-handed people. Oh. Yeah, couldn't that cause a little bit of a problem if you're a lefty and you got to shoot, the enemy, and you're like, hold on a second, and I got to go over to the other side. And so all these sort of examples of how right-handed people have a built-in advantage. And then I ask the left-handed people, do you hate right-handed people? Do you think they're bad people? And they're like, no, they just have an advantage built into the system. They don't see it, but the left-handed people see it all the time. So that allows us to have a conversation about white privilege. And you might be the most hardworking, from the bottom of society, white person that ever was. And you put yourself next to someone who's not white and from a similar background, and you've got advantages. I mean, one of the things it's amazing the advantages I have as a white person. If let's say as an example, let's say I was at Fred Meyer, and they have these automated checkout now where you don't have actual people. You can check out yourself, and those checkout things are based on kind of an honor principle. I mean, I know they have cameras and stuff, but it's possible that you could not scan something and put it in your bag. I'm not saying that I've ever done it, but it could happen. Nobody ever comes over and double checks my stuff. And if I do get caught, I'll be like, oh, sorry, I thought it's, and I walk out. I've got, like, in that situation where somebody else may be down on the ground, hogtied, and I've got plenty of examples of how that does. I'm just one little way that I experience, I've never been pulled over by the cops for not using my turn signal. I've got so many African-American students who tell me stories about how they've been pulled over for not using their turn signal, turning on their turn signal too early, turning on their turn signal too late, crowding a lane, which I don't even know what that is. I mean, being in sort of the wrong place at the wrong time, just on and on and on. So having an honest discussion about privilege has to happen. And there's so much denial. And again, this is why I think the book White Fragility has become really important to people, because how do you, you know, convince people that this conversation is important? So courageous conversations are a part of it. And then again, I think thanks to Zoom and all these platforms we're on, we now have an opportunity to have some of these conversations, which we're having today. We want to talk about, I always sort of try to, sociologists love to put things in 3 levels, like here's the 3 things you need to know, or here's the 3 parts. For some reason, 3 is the magic number for us. But I do think there are these sort of 3 areas that we address bias on. One is the institutional level, the laws, right? We still have laws that are rooted in bias. Oregon, as you may know, was founded as a white-only state. The 1859 Constitution said that Negroes and mulattoes cannot live here, and Chinese people aren't allowed to own property. That was written into our state. If you ever wonder why Oregon is so white, there's some good historical institutional reasons for that. That was not, that was enforced until the 1920s, but it wasn't, the language wasn't actually taken out of the Constitution in Oregon until the year 2001. The word mulatto and Negro were in the Oregon Constitution. So we have lots of laws that we have to fix, but also when we talk about institutional bias, we talk about our workplace or our schools or other institutions, our churches, and, you know, other establishments that may have inequitable practices, and how do we change those things? So for example, if you're working at Nike and want to recruit some, you know, Black executives in, you're going to invite them to live in, you know, Washington County, Oregon, where Nike is. You may be recruiting people into a place that's somewhat hostile. You know, if I'm a Black accountant, I don't know what they do over at Nike, and, you know, I'm coming and I've got a teenage son, and you're like, you want me to move to Oregon? And my son's going to be driving around in a car in Oregon, right? You have to have policies that make it easier for those people to exist in this space. So when we say institution, we're not talking about just getting rid of Jim Crow. We're talking about really looking at making more equitable decisions in our institutions. Who are we marginalizing? You know, is there room at the table for transgender people? Have transgender people been told that the table even exists? We really have to have good outreach around that. So there's a lot of work on the institutional level around bias, and that's where we do a lot of these trainings to kind of help people address this issue. They're also the cultural level. One of my favorite Martin Luther King quotes is, America is never more divided than Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. when everybody goes to their separate churches, right? And they have the white people over here. I mean, in my high school, you know, the white kids sat over here, the Black kids sat over here, the South Asian kids sat over here, and, you know, and lunchroom looked like the most segregated Jim Crow place you could imagine. So how do we sort of put ourselves in our own cultural bubbles and get out of that? Because we know, the research shows us, the more interaction that you have with people who are different from you, the more that affects your attitudes about those people. My grandmother, after 9/11, said some really ignorant things about Muslims. She lived in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I said, Grandma, how many Muslims do you know? Because she was just like going off, and I'm like, Grandma, come on, no, that's not right. And I sent her this book that I really love. It's around here somewhere. It's just called Islam for Beginners. And as someone who grew up as a WASP, it helped me to understand the history of the Muslim faith. And I sent it to her, and she read it completely. And she called me and she said, Randy, I finished reading that book, and I was really amazed. And I said, well, what was the most amazing thing, Grandma? Because for me, it's always like the schism between Sunnis and Shiites and kind of keeping all that straight. And she said that Muslims worship the same God that I do. All right. I mean, this is just sort of basic ignorance that was easily cured with a book. And I said, well, Grandma, why don't you, I'm sure there are Muslims in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Why don't you reach out to them? Because she was all into sort of interfaith fellowship, or interfellowship among different Christian faiths. So my little grandma, who was about this big, the first thing she did is she went to the 7-Eleven and asked the guy in a turban, hey, can you teach me about Islam? He was a Sikh, but he was apparently a very nice gentleman, and said, I'm not Muslim, I'm Sikh, but there is a Muslim mosque, you know, down the road. And so she went and knocked on the door, and they opened the door, and they were like, hello, hello, hello. And then I looked down and I saw my little grandma, and she said, you know, I'm Presbyterian, but I feel like you guys, and we worship the same God, and maybe we should talk. And they started an interfaith fellowship because my grandma bothered to jump out of her bubble. And I have to think for her Presbyterian congregation, that had a huge impact, including to this day, or they still do the fellowship. My grandmother passed away a few years ago. But just think about how we bust out of our bubble, you know, how. And so here's one of the things that's really encouraging. I promise I'm going to get to the questions and chats if there's any. One of the biggest attitude shifts that we've had, and as long as we've been measuring attitudes, is the shift around gay marriage. That 10 years ago, the majority of Americans were against gay marriage. When we do these surveys, you know, are you for it or against it? Majority. Now the majority of Americans are for it. In a 10-year period, there was a shift from one side to the other. That's insane when we think about attitude shifts. Why did that happen? That happened because people came out. Because it wasn't just gay people in San Francisco and the images that we would get fed of like gay pride in the Castro and some guy dancing in assless chaps. So that's what gay people do. All of a sudden, people started coming out, especially thanks to the activism of groups like ACT UP and, you know, how we had to like really take the AIDS crisis seriously. And all of a sudden it was, you know, people in our family and people that we worked with and teachers. I mean, God, I remember in the 80s, they were saying, oh, if you're, you know, you have a teacher who's gay, he or she will turn your kid into a homosexual and or worse, right? And all of a sudden, and we had gay teachers and nothing happened. And so that exposure to people who are different than you dramatically changed the attitude around same-sex marriage, completely flipped it. And so when we have that exposure to people who are different from us, it's hard to have those attitudes. My wife was an undocumented immigrant. She has her green card if you're with ICE, was an undocumented immigrant. And I know that people in my family, who I won't mention, Dad, attitudes have changed because they know her. Undocumented, those illegal, but she's all right. She seems pretty smart. Like all of a sudden that goes away. So how we bust out of our cultural bubbles. And this is why I think food is really important. You just want to lure people with falafels and I love going out. I mean, it sounds weird, but often I'm meeting neo-Nazis and white supremacists to have conversations and to interview them. And I'm always like ordering bagels and Corona. Corona, the beer, not the virus. To just sort of, you know, I was at this one neo-Nazi's apartment in Southeast Portland, and he had all these DVDs, and he had like the whole collection of the Family Guy, like that animated series. He loved the Family Guy. And I'm like, hey man, let's look at who made this show, and had all these Jewish names and then the credits of the writers. I'm like, you know, the show that you love wouldn't exist if you didn't you needed Jewish writers to write it. He's like, oh. And then we went out to Taco Bell one night. We'd been drinking a little bit and went out to Taco Bell, and I'm like, yeah, you know, Mexicans and burritos. And he said, well, we would have invented burritos sooner or later. I'm like, yeah, but you didn't. So anyway, busting out of the cultural bubble. And then the last level is just working on ourselves, that we have to really understand that we internalize all this stuff. We're born blank slates. This is the sociologist talking. We're born blank slates, and all this stuff gets written on us at a very early age, all these biases. And so we have to constantly be working on ourselves. I never say I'm not a racist. I am a racist. I learned racism as an early age, but I'm also anti-racist, and kind of like an alcoholic who's in recovery, who will never say I'm not an alcoholic. I'm continually working on this. I find myself engaged in implicit bias and stereotypical thinking all the time, but I have to be mindful of it. I have to practice. I have a 5-year-old daughter who I started realizing was internalizing white supremacy, that white was the normal. And she would say, you know, she would talk about my friends and then also my Black friends, that white was sort of the normal and Black was the exception. And so I was like, holy shit, I'm raising a white supremacist. This might not look good for me. And so we, you know, really started spending time with her talking about this. Today, she's at camp with her Black Lives Matter t-shirt on. And she's very conscious of racial imbalance and injustice in society. So that, but she's internalizing it just like everyone else. So we really need to kind of work on ourselves and do that kind of good reflection. And so that's why my little mantra is, this is what I'll leave you with, is we're works in progress. We are works in progress. There's some country music song that says, I'm a work in progress, which is something I tell my wife all the time. Like, I'm a work in progress. I'm not done yet. But we're all constantly on this path to work towards a greater understanding and to reduce the trauma of people who've been experiencing the kind of bad end of the bias stick for a long time. And so that gives us permission to make mistakes. That gives us permission to ask questions. That gives us permission to go on journeys and learn about specific things like race or a particular religion that we don't know about. A lot of people don't know about the Sikh faith or know about, you know, indigenous faiths. And so, so we're on that journey. Okay. So, so I wanted this is supposed to be a conversation, you know, these are lunch and learn. And so hopefully people are lunching and learning, but I wanted to be able to at least spend the last, you know, 6 or 7 minutes talking about things that might be relevant to you, or if you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to do that. Lou, do you want to?
Yeah, you guys are welcome to just unmute yourself and chime in if you want to ask a question, or you can write a question in the chat box if there's anything that you wanted to ask Randy about. Go for it.
Including about Linda Ronstadt singles. I can answer all your vinyl needs.
Hey, Randy. I appreciated you bringing up your dad here. I'll do video so you can see who's talking to you. You know, and we all have family members, we all know people who are struggling to understand what's going on and who maybe are internalizing shame through this and then reacting defensively. And I was wondering if you could recommend any books or videos or, you know, any means to help create that bridge for people who might be a little reluctant.
Yeah. I mean, my dad, like all of us, is the product of his environment and his time, and it's very easy to fight. It's very, I mean, there's a long history of me and my dad going at it around these subjects. So, there are great things, and I'm glad that White Fragility and How to Be an Anti-Racist Activist, and you know, some of these books that are really targeting white people are doing so well right now. The White Fragility book is really helpful. There's also Robin DiAngelo has some good videos. But here's the thing. You can read. I mean, there's a lot of people that should read that book that aren't going to read that book. But here's the thing that really works. It's that we all have capacity for empathy, right? We all want to root for the underdog. We all sort of know what it's like to kind of get screwed over. Even if we're the most privileged person in the world, we've had moments where we were on the outside looking in. And so that notion of empathy is our way in. And once you can start talking about the issue of trauma, and I always feel like whenever we talk about trauma, we should also talk about resilience and how resilient people are in the face of trauma. But when you help people to understand, especially racial trauma, the reality of slavery and how that persists when slavery ended and what it means. There was an interview with a musician who is an African-American drummer in Nashville. Of course, so already he's getting microaggressions. People are like, oh, aren't you really a funk drummer? What are you doing playing country music? But this was after the murder of the gentleman in South Georgia who was out for a jog. He said, I try to jog every day in Nashville, which is, you know, disproportionately white community. And every time before I go out for a jog, I kiss my wife because I know that I might not come back. Like, that's something I never think about. I try to jog every day too, but I don't think, well, I'm going to get murdered. So if we can help people to understand that the trauma, it's very real. And sometimes it happens in micro ways. Sometimes it's somebody just clutching their purse because you got on an elevator. You know, you were black and you got on an elevator with a white woman and she clutched her purse. There are little things here and there. And so the way that we describe microaggressions is like a scratch. You get one little scratch and somebody makes a comment. It's not about, oh, you're well dressed for, or you're well spoken, or I didn't mean anything by it, or, you know, or it's one little scratch is okay. But you get another scratch and it gets annoying, and you get another scratch and all of a sudden you've got an open wound, and you get another scratch and that wound isn't going to heal because here comes another scratch. There's constant reminders of the dehumanization. Turning on the news and seeing, you know, another police shooting is another scratch. And so if we help people to understand that wounding and how there hasn't been a chance to heal, not just from slavery, but just from the scratch that just came, you know, a few minutes ago, that I think we can build those bridges without having people to have to read books or watch documentaries like 13th. I mean, there's all these good things out there, but just having a human conversation about cumulative trauma and that often has been my experience, including working with people who are white supremacists. There are so many former white supremacists out there, And that's how they got it. Somebody reached out to them and shared their pain. You know, this is what it's like to be Jewish in America. Let me tell you, when you fly that Nazi flag, what it means to me, right? To have that human connection around these issues of trauma is such a way of opening that door into people's hearts. So thanks for that question, Ian. It's such an important one.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, Jesperi was at Stone Mountain. Yeah. The Stone Mountain is a very interesting phenomena to deal with because it's a mountain and it has such a history behind it. I mean, my feeling is that they could really use that park and turn it into a center for racial reconciliation. I mean, let's use that great space that we have to talk about race, and that way we don't have to blow up the mountain. We can just sort of, you know, acknowledge the past and learn from it. It's kind of exciting that my little town is so in the news these days, so for better or worse.
Randy, I have a question. How do you deal with the conversation about pulling down statues and where you begin, where you end? You know, is it going to be the Lincoln Memorial next, or the Jefferson Memorial, or, you know, where does it end? I'm constantly being confronted with that, and what is legitimate, what isn't.
That's right, and thanks, Buckley, for that. I mean, there's a conversation that's happening. I mean, that's the goal, I think, of pulling down a statue of George Washington. It's not to erase George Washington. I mean, I was just commenting this morning is that you will find no statues of Hitler in Germany, and yet they still pretty well know their history. Right? You don't need a statue of Hitler. History exists. You can't erase history. History was, and there's this great thing called books for people.
It used to be.
Yeah, but there is, I Googled, or I went on Amazon a couple of weeks ago and put in Robert E. Lee into Amazon and got over 8,000 hits. So, you know, if you want to learn about Robert E. Lee, you don't need a street or a statue. But the larger answer to that question is that it's sparking that conversation. It's sparking that conversation, and the conversation is what's important, more important than, you know, the statue. And I think, you know, until the point is, we have to acknowledge that there were founding fathers who were slave owners, and there were also founding fathers who weren't slave owners. You know, John Adams, Hamilton. I'm not going to burst into song, but, you know, Hamilton, Thomas Paine, John Quincy Adams. I mean, there were all these abolitionists who were part of our founding as well. They weren't just all slave owners, but we really have to have that conversation about the irony of Thomas Jefferson, you know, saying all men are created equal, but, and so it's acknowledging that past, and we're like in a big cover up. It's the worst kept secret in the world that America was founded on the backs of slaves. And until we have that conversation, there's going to be some statues that get pulled down because people are like, no, you need to talk about these things. So it's part of the process.
Also, part of that is that belief in this country that, you know, the Constitution was inspired by God, and that our, you know, founding fathers were led to this, and you know, all of that kind of thing. So by pulling them down, you know, you're committing an act of aggression against religion, against people who God personally chose.
Yes, and it's the white God. I mean, just Google image God, and he's a white guy who's like 65 years old. We've never known much about teenage God, which has always bothered me. What was God doing when he was 16? But yeah, we've racialized God, and I think that's a factor. Cool. Well, you can find me, randyblazak.com. If you have other questions that we didn't get to, randyblazak.com. You can contact me through that portal on my website. I'd be happy to further this conversation.
Randy, thank you so much for being here. It's been really great. I'm so glad so many people got to show up for it. And you can like the Hearth team on Facebook if you want to see what is up and coming on our Lunch and Learns. And maybe we'll have Randy back for round 2. We'll see.
Right on.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Go well.